Chapter 26. Trauma. A small caravan made its way from the oasis to meet with anyone and everyone along the roads that had now been formed. The ease of travel had become a refreshing development from the paths they had been content with up until this point in Vacuo's history. Nothing was without its price, however. Wherever there was accessibility, there was opportunity. Divisions between cultures and kingdoms had only grown more fierce over the recent years, as borders between each nation became more and more pronounced. Each nation that had something to offer the other was being seen more in line with what they took. What was once a new face among their group became a potential threat to their homes. The fear wasn't without warrant, however. Today was no exception. A man dialed hastily at what those he traded with in Atlas as a scroll to the emergency number. It was bad enough his wife had gone into labor in the middle of their journey. It was even worse where they were. Bandits had become more and more frequent as the nations put more and more distance between each other. Every effort to confront them became a national crisis when militaries traveled too close to the other's borders. He cursed human nature and the machine that couldn't pick up a signal so close to the mountains. He rushed over to their wagon, and he heard his wife coming to the end of another contraction. The noise of her scream echoed for miles, and he watched helplessly as he saw her in this state. He had no words, just hands to offer and comfort that it would all be worthwhile. She returned the look drenched in sweat with a smile. A brief raise of her chin told him to do his job while she did hers. He nodded with a smile as he grabbed his rifle and continued to watch for Grim. He checked the chamber for a filled dust capsule and looked up to see if anything had come too close to threaten his wife or child. The valley seemed surprisingly quiet as he looked around for a threat. Another scream from his wife grabbed his attention instinctively, and he turned to check on her. He tapped his stopwatch, timing the contractions. It wouldn't be long now, and they could start moving again. The covered platform they had moved her into still had light and bedding, and he remembered those eyes. Comforted that she was going to be okay, he turned back to his post and continued to watch for threats. Nothing. Another contraction, another glance. The baby was almost here. He turned back to find a gun barrel in his face, and then everything went white. The gunshot was the first of many to follow. The other members of their group shared the concern for the woman to a degree, yet the discharge of dust is what brought all of their attention to the rear of their group. A massive horde of bandits opened fire at the people and Faunus who came rushing to see what was going on. It didn't take a lot of time or bodies to see that there was a raid, and they started shooting back. Yet numbers were not on their side. The screams from the rear carriage turned to weeping as she realized what was going on. Bandits ignored it and began looting the furthermost wagons to find materials they could profit from. A man in a turban made his way through their score and observed passively all of the small arms and food they uncovered. It was when he heard the woman crying rather than screaming, he smiled. The men and women who had joined his group knew their leader enjoyed cruelty more for its own sake than any objective goal or standard. The brighter among them had even come to the conclusion that sadism was his standard. He pulled back the tarp and saw a woman laying on her back with a pool of blood and phlegm at her feet. "She's with child, sir." He reached over to grab his weapon, and the woman holding it gave no protest. He pointed it briefly at her and met her eyes. She was obviously in the middle of another intense contraction, but the fear of her mortality in the hands of a bandit silenced her entirely. He pouted. "Oh, no more screaming. Here, let me help." He raised the barrel a fraction and shot the dust at the wagon's cover above her. The fire-based dust ignited it immediately, and the wood around her quickly began to embrace the flames. He took a moment to take it all in, and then turned away as she merely began to weep, letting the noise wash over him again as the screams returned. He walked away as if his favorite song had simply begun to play, and made his way towards examining whatever else they had uncovered from this raid. His attention was drawn back when a new scream joined the chorus. The wagon continued to burn, and the woman's body was now little more than ashes. Yet cradled between her pelvis bones was a pristine child laid thrashing against the fire, licking his flesh, and finding no purchase. The cries that were supposed to be his introduction into breathing turned to coughs as he began to suffocate from the smoke. The man in the turban watched him for a moment, and then turned to those nearby. "Grab him. I think we'll have a use for this one." Brief glances were exchanged before they decided to tear down the wagon around him so they could reach the baby without risk of being caught in the fire for long. Though the child had clearly demonstrated his semblance to all of them, it was clear he also felt pain, and so the bandit handled him with care. He continued to cry, scream, and thrash against any sensation that his nerves picked up. Even the hardest of criminals in their midst felt an ounce of heartache seeing so much pain in one so helpless. Yet their recent excursions had gotten them used to mirroring their leader's sadism. "What are we going to do with him?" a nearby bandit asked, still holding the fire-based weapon. Abimelech turned and fired on the baby, still in the bandit's arms. The child entirely absorbed the blow, and not even the heat was registered by him apart from the shock of being shot. "Target practice and music," Abimelech answered, and then made his way over to where a grim Geist was waiting for him. The wailing echoed through their camp as new recruits were dragged forward for their initiation. Abimelech stepped forward, ready to meet them all in person. "You are here to honor the Destroyer. Prove to all of us you're worthy to be called his disciples, or be cast aside. And don't worry." He paused, taking a rifle from one of his lieutenants. "It won't kill him." A shot was let off, and the young ones flinched as the infant chained to a pole let out another bellow of agony as the fire passed over and evaporated across his face. They began looking at each other, asking unvoiced questions as his body remained pristine apart from malnutrition. The volleys were sounded, and the ones that refused were killed. Just another day among the men of the mountain. It had become commonplace to prove their commitment to cruelty by getting used to committing the most atrocious acts possible. None of them would ever claim they liked it, but over time, they got used to it. Abimelech treated the boys' cries like a conductor would a symphony, and even returning to his hut, he would pause to make sure he cried every time a shot was heard. Content with himself, he retired to his isolation, and the rest of the men made their way to where they would find respite for the night. Fires were doused, and black materials were raised to hide their presence from anyone brave enough to consider following the noises. As silent as a living creature could be in their environment, a single presence made their way through the camp. A guard passed him by and recognized his garments with a nod. It was briefly returned, and he continued on his way. A second man on patrol for the night continued as well, and continued to pass time by counting the tent stakes he passed along the way. He had become so used to this routine to keep his mind engaged that he almost didn't notice a naked body rolled next to a tent. It wasn't uncommon to find dead bodies discarded for various reasons, but he noticed this one. Turning quickly to find the one that had just passed him, he started running to only where he imagined he would have gone if he had continued his current pace. He slowed down when he saw he had remained casual and continued his expected route. The bandit raised his rifle and allowed the noise of him chambering around to reach the potential infiltrator's ears. He paused and slowly turned to face him. Another familiar face confirmed it was just fatigue getting the best of him. They both belonged there and knew each other. A slight shrug and a smile was made before moving his weapon away from his face. "What's wrong?" the bandit grumbled in response. "Thought I saw something. Just a body someone left outside their tent. I thought it was you." He turned around to get back to where he needed to be. A slight rush of wind passed him, and he shook it off. The man that now stood behind him had been rendered unconscious by an expertly thrusted end of a trident. Without a sound, he caught the man as he fell and adjusted his left arm and leg to assume a sleeping position. Ashpenaz stood up quickly and made his way towards where he heard the child crying. He paused briefly in disgust when he discovered he couldn't have been more than 2 years old. Waving at the boy still twitching from the adrenaline response to the last series of initiations, he couldn't reply, but saw his weapon wasn't a gun.
Food?
He rasped, as if that was the only other expectation he had in his existence. Ashpenaz shook his head and raised his trident to cut his chains. He caught the body and quickly put a finger to his mouth. "They're not going to hurt you anymore," he whispered, and without a word jumped between the wooden stakes erected as barriers around the campsite and began running. The thrashing was uncomfortable, and the boy was confused, but he had never known a sensation so sweet as to no longer have the hot chains clinging to his flesh. He started to tear up as he considered the meaning of the man's words. He wanted to ask him what hurt meant, but remembered the gesture and understood he wasn't allowed to open his mouth right now. He grabbed onto the man's fatigues and finally fell asleep. He didn't know where he was going or knew anything other than where he'd been, but chose in that moment to be grateful for what he now had. The sun rose and the commotion drew Abimelech's attention away from his isolation. They were supposed to be tearing down the camp and moving on, yet all of his strongest looked like they were in one place. "What's going on?" The men shot up at their leader's voice and started quietly arguing who was going to tell them. It didn't take more than 2 footfalls before one of them was shoved forward out of panic. The boy, my lord, he broke his chains. Abimelech thrust one of his arms from under his robes and crushed the man's head. The lifeless husk fell to the ground like a rag doll, and he took the time to examine the material left in his hand before shaking it away. "Where's the boy?" he asked calmly, as if he had misheard. None of them responded. In the time it took for one of them to move their eyes away from the question, they were all torn to pieces. Body parts scattered and fell from the motion, and his robes were now drenched in gore. He let his turban cover his face and began making his way back to his hut. He paused when he noticed no one was moving. "Get moving!" he yelled and forced his way into his hut. The activity picked up immediately outside, and he moved to the center of the room. Collapsing to his knees, he began trembling and looking at the blood that still matted to his clawed hands. Hyperventilating, he began muttering to himself over and over again. No, I can still bring you back. I will show you we are worthy of your attention again. Please give us back your magic. Please give me the power to bring back." The darkness of his hut began coiling around him like a maelstrom, with him at its center. A distant yet distinct voice whispered to him through the tempest as his aura began to glow. "It's time to move." He began stuttering through tears and sobs. "I won't fail her again. She will." The presence cut him off. "She will indeed. Now let's get back to work. Vacuo must suffer. Not just one boy." At this affirmation from his companion, he sniffed one last time and gathered himself underneath his coverings. Hiding all weakness, he made his way to leave as his hut turned from tempest to beast, thundering its way behind his master and slave.